Thank you all for coming here today. My name is Penny Wright, and we're delighted to have you, and we're especially delighted, of course, to have our second visit from author Sheila Kohler, who had a sort of a disjointed trip out here because I think trains aren't running and buses were taken and things like that, so we're very happy to have her here. Sheila Kohler is the author of 10 novels, 3 volumes of short fiction, and many essays and short stories. Her most recent book is a memoir titled Once We Were Sisters. It was published by Penguin in 2017, and it received really wonderful reviews in various papers. At least I read a great one in the New York Times. Canongate bought the world rights and published the book in both hardback and paperback. Sheila Kohler has won many prizes, including the Willa Cather Award, the Antioch Review Prize, the Smart Family Foundation Prize, the O. Henry twice, and she's been included in Best American Short Stories, most recently in 2013. Her work has been published in 13 countries, and she has been a fellow at the Cullman Center at the New York Public Library and has taught widely, this year at Princeton University. Her novel, Cracks, was made into a film with directors Jordan and Ridley Scott, with Eva Green playing Miss G. You can find Sheila Kohler's blog at Psychology Today under Dreaming for Freud. It's an honor to have her here. Please welcome Sheila Kohler.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction, and thank you all for coming out today. Nice to see you all here. So it seems most appropriate that I should be talking about silenced voices today, because I think we've been surrounded recently by so many women who have broken out of their silence and who have come forth to talk about sexual harassment. The story that I told in my memoir was of a similar nature. My sister, I had one sister, an older sister, who was killed in a car accident, as it was called. Her husband, who was a very well-known heart surgeon in Johannesburg, South Africa, was driving the car, and there was a history of battering. My sister had 6 children, and the youngest was 3 at the time, and her husband drove off the road. There were no other cars in sight. They checked with the marks on the road afterwards. He was not a drinker, he was a heart surgeon, and he just went off the road and into a telephone pole, and my sister was killed instantly. So my mother told me, who knows how these things happen. And the husband, who may have been intending to kill himself, did not. He survived the accident and actually went on, although he was damaged, he did go on to remarry and went on to some extent anyway with his life. So the question at the time was, my mother called me in the night and told me this had happened, and I went out immediately to South Africa, and I wanted, knowing the story, that there had been this history of battering, not just of my sister, but of also the children. I wanted to prosecute. I wanted to speak up, to speak out, and my mother, who had, before it happened, often said to me, he's going to kill her. I know he's going to kill her. She said, no, I want no scandal, no scandal. She said, think of the children. And there were these 6 children, and the youngest being 3. And she said, he's all they've got. Now he is all that is left to them. We cannot put the children through this kind of publicity and the scandal that would come out if we tried to prosecute. And what would we say? Anyway, so I went along with what my mother had, her wishes at the time, although I was very angry, as you can imagine. But I did turn to the page because that was one place where I felt I could speak up, speak out. So I went back to Paris. I was living in France at the time, and I wrote in 3 months. I wrote a book, putting it all down on the page, and sent it off to a publisher. And it came back very quickly, and she turned it down. And I had the gall at this point to call her up and say, why did you turn my book down? And she kindly took the call, and she said it wasn't good enough. So I thought about that, and I thought, well, I have to make this story good enough. I want people to read this story. So I decided to go back to school. I came actually to this country. There were other things going on in my life, which if you read the memoir, you'll find out about. I came and I did an MFA in creative writing, and I started to write the story, but as fiction, coming on a slant, with the idea in my mind that this book was not going to just be for me. It wasn't just an occasion for me to put down my feelings on the page. It was something that somebody else might find something in, that they might be able to find something perhaps about themselves in it, or at least that reading it would take them out of themselves for a while to some other place. In other words, I learned the art of fiction, and I started to publish novels, and they turned always around the same theme, always the story of these lost girls, silenced girls in a way, because you have to place the whole story in the context of where it happened, which was South Africa, which was a country of silence. Many things were silenced there. Of course, this was the apartheid period, where there was separation of the races, and so that this attitude, this patriarchal attitude, the attitude of the men, in many ways was reflected not just in the relationships between men and women, but between white and black and all the other kinds of, there were, South Africa is a country filled with people from all over the world. We have Indians, we have Malays, we have people who were called coloureds, who were of mixed blood. So there were many kinds of silences, many things that were not said. And we were really taught as young girls growing up there in very privileged conditions that there were things that you did not talk about. So silence of one kind or another. And I think too that we were, as women, writing in a tradition that was of women's writing that existed up until that time. So who did we read when we went to school? And we read writers like Charlotte Bronte. Now, Charlotte Bronte, of course, writing in the 19th century, I'm opening this out a little bit so that you're having not just my story and my own book, but also some of the other women who came before us and who led the way, if you will, bravely. And if you think of these three Bronte sisters out on the moors in northern England, and if any of you have been there, you will know how desolate and cold it is. So these three girls who started writing very young, including the brother, there was the boy, the Branwell brother, who was a writer too, you can go and see all this juvenilia if you want to. So this whole family was writing. Then Charlotte Bronte began writing poetry, and she decided to send her poems to the poet laureate, Robert Southey. So she sent them off very bravely, and this is what Southey answered. He said, "Literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be. The more she is engaged in her proper duties, the less she will have, the less leisure she will have, even for literature, even as an accomplishment or a recreation." So this was the letter. At the time, Charlotte Bronte was working in a school for girls where she was teaching, and she did not enjoy being a teacher. And she had very rude things to say in her letters about her students. But anyway, she got this letter and she responded. And her response is also wonderful. It was very beautiful. She said, "Thank you so much. I'm sure your advice is very valuable." And she said, "But do you know that sometimes at night I do think." And you could just sort of get the irony behind all of this. They published their poems, they self-published them. They then were, I think they sold 3 copies. They then started trying to publish their novels. And all 3 of them, the Bronte girls, each had a novel. Charlotte Bronte had a book called The Professor, which I don't imagine any of you have read. Her Emily Bronte had written Wuthering Heights, which I'm sure you have read, and Anne Bronte had a book called Agnes Grey. So they each had these novels, and they wrapped them up in a brown paper packet, wrote the name of the publisher, and sent them off. And the publisher turned them down, kept coming back. And these 3 girls, who were very thrifty and didn't have very much money, and were also very innocent, sent it out again. So again and again, each publisher, having the name of the one before crossed out, got the same package. Until finally, a rather unscrupulous publisher called Newby wrote back a long letter and said, "I like 2 of the books. I like Wuthering Heights and I like Agnes Grey, but I do not like The Professor. I won't take that one. I'll take these 2." And this is actually a scene that I wrote up in my book, because I just thought how devastating. But Charlotte was galvanized by this, and perhaps also by the fact that her father at that point had his cataracts removed. And in those days, of course, this was an operation that was done without any anesthesia. Charlotte was asked by her father to assist. So if you can imagine, she was there while the operation was going on, and watching the cataracts being removed from her father's eyes. Anyway, she then sat by his bedside, in the dark pretty much, and started writing her book, Jane Eyre. And whether it was her father's helplessness lying there in the dark, and the fact that she had become his eyes and his arms and his life, really, and his voice, of course, he wasn't even supposed to speak, he just lay there. She managed to write anyway half of the book in Manchester, sitting by his bedside. and this is all a story that I have told, and of course the sequel in Becoming Jane Eyre, because once the book, and it actually did come out before her sister's books, once it came out, it was overnight a bestseller, huge success, and one asks oneself why. Here was a woman who dared anyway to speak up. She took the moral high road, when Mr. Rochester says, but what? When she's discovered he has, of course, a wife, and Mr. Rochester says, but who would care if you just stayed with me? And she says, but I would care, I would care, I would know. She takes the moral high road, which doesn't mean to say that overnight we had women, after all, she was obliged then to come forth with her own name, to write, to admit that Currer Bell was actually Charlotte Bronte. But if you look at Jane Eyre carefully enough, you will see that each time that she begins to feel passionately about Mr. Rochester, what happens? The mysterious things happen. There's Mr. Rochester is set on fire, for one, to start. Then what happens next is that when she's lying in her bed, somehow someone comes in and tears the veil of her wedding veil. And then, of course, finally, she is confronted by Bertha, who is this animal-like creature. And Charlotte Bronte portrays her like this. But it is, one might think, so part of Jane Eyre, this animal-like presence in the upper floor at Thornfield Hall, who descends in the night, and who ultimately sets the whole place on fire, and also diminishes Mr. Rochester considerably. So this is Charlotte Bronte's story and her struggles, and I'm full of admiration for her, which is why I turned to the page, writing Becoming Jane Eyre. But there was another writer who read Jane Eyre, and who was fascinated by what she called, she said, talking about Bertha Mason, the mad wife in the attic, she said, she seemed such a poor ghost, I thought I'd like to write about her life. And this was Jean Rhys. And so in a book called Sargasso Sea, she writes the life of the mad wife, who Jane Eyre has said to Mr. Rochester, but you were cruel to put her up there in the attic all by herself. And he says, oh, you don't know, she was a degenerate from the beginning. She was off with every man, basically. In other words, she was capable of feeling passion. Passion was not really possible for the 19th century woman. And even in Jane Eyre, and once the book came out, she was accused of being coarse. So Jean Rhys took this in hand and wrote a very beautiful book, which was turned down and turned down over the course of her life. Jean Rhys actually was born in 1890, but she lived a very long life, and this book finally came out in 1966, and it became a bestseller, and she became quite famous, also because there was a program on the BBC about her. And so people thought she was dead. Yes. People thought she was dead. She had written 4 wonderful novels before, but she disappeared from view. Her voice was lost and was gone. And when they came to tell her, but wait a minute, you're famous, she just looked at them and she said, it's too late. So maybe it was too late for her, but it wasn't too late for us. And I think that all of us can turn to these books and feel galvanized to tell our own stories, which is what, in a way, happened to me with my sister's story. story. And I wrote it finally. I wrote for many years in fiction. But finally, I thought, no, I'm going to write this as a memoir. It's time to put this down, the truth. The children that my mother had said so poignantly to me, think of the children. The children are now married, have children of their own, they're grown. And I felt they need to know this. They knew it anyway, as children always do. And much of the information of the batterings came from these children themselves, who came and told me about what their father had done. He was a complex character, this man, interesting, because he was a heart surgeon. So he had, taken the oath to do no harm. And one of his daughters told me the story of how when he lost a patient, he would weep. He would sit down and weep. But she also told me that they had a beautiful boat. These were people who lived in, very luxurious surroundings. So anyway, they had a big boat. And the little girl, who was 8 years old or something, trying to use the winch. The winch is, if any of you are sailors here, a winch is made of steel. And the father grew impatient, just pulled it out of her hand and hit her over the head with his, and she just went flying across the deck of the boat. And she told me both these stories about her father. So he was a very complex character. And the children had, of course, mixed feelings. It was their father. So I wrote this book, and I said to the family, and indeed my own children, because not just my sister's story, it's also my own. And I said to them, don't read it. And this is sort of a pact that you can have with your family. I have one of my daughters who is a writer, and I said to her, listen, I know, I'm your material. So go for it, which of course she did. But I don't have to read it, and she very often doesn't want me to read it. So, but the unfortunate thing was, of course, that that my sister's children live in Cape Town at the moment, which is, not an enormous town. And one of my nieces said that she was, at a party, that a woman came up to her and said, "Oh, my dear, the book." And she said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And she said, "But you must know," she said, "is it all true?" So they were confronted by the fact that this information had now become public. Now, did I have the right to do this? Did I have the right to tell this story or not? It's certainly a moral dilemma, I think, for each one of us when we come out with a story that exposes people's lives to the public. And we have to think, I think, is it worth it? Is the book worth it? Is the game worth the candle? And I leave that up to you, perhaps to tell me, hoping that you might be interested in the book, or that you have books of your own that you're thinking about, and perhaps have some questions for me. Yes, Penny. Thanks for coming. Thanks for coming.
Absolutely, it's worth it. It's the truth, and it's your truth.
Well, mine and the truth of many of us here, men or women, I think. How much can you say? How much do you tell? Yes.
What you need to.
Yes, and there are, there's recent events that are going on around us with these women who have dared to come forth and actually speak up about sexual harassment. And that's, I think, something that probably all the women here in the audience have had in one form or another, and perhaps some of the men, I don't know. But certainly it was something that I have experienced and that I wrote about. And just to tell you that these things are going on right now, I wrote about an experience with a doctor in France. And when I finished the essay, it didn't go in the memoir, but when I finished the essay, please come in, yes. When I finished the essay, I thought, well, I'll just look look this up. I'll just Google this guy. He was, this was many years ago. And I put it into the joys of the internet. Google, up comes the guy. And remembered his name. There he is. He is still practicing in a very lucrative part of Paris. So I wrote the essay and I sent it off to an editor at the Paris Review. Nice man, interested, says, I'd love to put it. You can find this, by the way. It's on the blog, so you can find it on the internet. It's called Fantasy and Reality. Just put my name in, Sheila Kohler, and the Paris Review. And he said, I really like this essay, but I have to tell you, I can't publish it with the doctor's name. And I said, why not? He said, I might be sued. It's your word against his. He said, of course I believe you, but it's your word against mine. And he said, and somebody might recognize him too. So he asked me to put in a sentence saying that the man was dead. He is not dead, ladies and gentlemen. So I changed his initials. So this is going on right now, and I was coward enough, or ambitious enough, if you will, because the Paris Review is a very good place to publish, and you want an audience. So I took out his name. Yes, Penny?
Well, when you were describing the fire, I couldn't help wondering if that was kind of a subconscious, symbolic anger at the rejection, at the suppression of her talent, that this was a marvelously subtle way of expressing it.
You mean the fire in Thornfield Hall,
Yes.
where Bertha, the mad wife, burns down the house, and also harms Mr. Rochester, so that we have a Mr. Rochester who is blinded, right? He's blinded by this fire. You might say his potency is limited at this point. He's reduced to what she was looking at, which was her father before her, lying with having had his cataracts removed. And he actually did regain his sight, as does Mr. Rochester. She allows him that. So yes, the whole fire obviously was, I think, probably for Charlotte Bronte writing the book, was symbolic, burning down this English establishment, burning down the, this position too of Mr. Rochester, my master, he's called all the way through the book. And for me, speaking about it here today, absolutely right. Obviously, what you bring to the page is also your life and the prism that you read through what you see. Yes, other thoughts, questions, remarks, comments? Yes.
Do you think, just getting back to literature, do you think that female writers who portray women today, like Handmaid's Tale or Margaret Atwood?
Yes, yes.
Do you think there's a tremendous difference in the freedom that her characters have?
Yes, I do. I mean, you have to, I don't have the time here to go through the whole progression, but you have to think, the 19th century, then what came afterwards, writers like, so Jane Eyre is a book which I think young women still read today. In fact, I know they do. And it helps them because she thinks for herself, she's independent, she dares to say what she thinks. But the passion side of it is very guarded, although she was accused of being very coarse when the book came out. But after that, of course, there were other women, brave women. One, actually, a woman who I'm thinking of now, who comes also from Africa, Doris Lessing. I don't know if any of you have read her, but Doris Lessing was one of the first women, or the first authors, to actually mention menstruation in her golden notebook. In other words, a woman's body, can you imagine? You couldn't possibly, in the 19th century, mention such a thing. You couldn't even really portray, women were supposed to, in the sexual act, they were supposed to close their eyes and think of England, right? To get from there to today is quite a step, and we went through a progression. And Doris Lessing, who got the Nobel Prize, bless her heart, I'm so glad she did, took us a step forward, and even a writer like Virginia Woolf also took a step forward, although the body there too, and she of course had such a sad life and a sad ending to her life. So, or Catherine Mansfield, little by little women have dared, and each one were in a progression going forward, I think, to stepping forward, to being able to write more and more freely and frankly about their hearts and also their bodies, which is such an important part of our lives, our everyday lives. Yes. Yes.
Doris Lessing has one of the greatest quotes, I think, in all literature, when she's living with another woman, the other woman, and it's the other woman's ex-husband, or somebody comes to the door and wants her to go to bed with them, and she says, no, I'm tired of this, I'm not. And he said, well, you don't look well, you need something, he gives her this whole story. And she says to him, if I had said yes, I would look healthy, wonderful, and beautiful. Obviously, the truth lies somewhere in between.
That's very good. Yes, I should tell my students that. Yes, I'm teaching these freshman seminars, and they are so young. They're 18. So they feel things very passionately and they put it down, it's all very one-dimensional. So to get the nuances, I'm going to use your quote. Yes, Anne, did you want to say something?
I was just going to point out the follow-up from Penny in a way that we all have our own truths about things, or beliefs about things, and we can be so committed to them and we can see those. So clearly, and yet there are other people who look at the same set of facts and see and interpret it differently. And particularly in the political age we live in, sometimes you run into people who, as you did last night, it happens, people who see truth in such different directions.
Yes,
And
it's
it all
very
depends on
disconcerting.
how you interpret the facts,
Yes, or know the facts.
Well, knowing the facts.
Yes,
and then how you then weigh them and look at them is kind of a different thing.
Yeah, that was another thing. Yes, I said to the students too, because when I walked into the classroom, I'm teaching a class called Silenced Voices, and the two books that I talked a little bit about here today, Jane Eyre and White Sagassa Sea, are part of it. But I started with Beowulf, and then I did John Gardner's Grendel, where he takes the monster. And the last two books are The Stranger, Camus' The Stranger, and then Kamel Daoud, who is an Arab, who writes a book called The Merceau Investigation. But this is a little bit bearing out your point here, that there are such different ways of looking on these things. So, in Jane Eyre, when you read Jane Eyre, you see Mr. Rochester is ultimately, he turns out to be the hero of the book. But if you read Wide Sargasso Sea, you do not like him very much at all. Obviously, he's the man who locks her up, the heroine, up in the attic. So, yes,
And
things...
certainly over time, even Charlotte Bronte saw her world, and everyone in the 19th century saw their world very differently than we see it in the 21st century. In the 21st century, most women would not respond the way Charlotte Bronte did. Oh, well, she was the one who had the guts to really make it happen, but very few women saw themselves as we see ourselves today. I think most women In other words, no, they're so much more capable and confident and.
Yes,
and-
because we have, first of all, we have the opportunity to work,
Yes,
to actually work. And work is something where you find out, who you are, what you can do, to your surprise, just like teaching, walking into a classroom. I had no idea that I could actually walk into a classroom and teach. I remember the first time I did, I thought, I'm going to pass out, I'll faint, You do it, and you find out you can do it, yes.
To this lady's point,
Yes.
when she speaks about the facts will not change.
Yes.
The atmosphere around the facts change.
Yep.
And we are the ones who have to keep the facts in focus, no matter what's going on.
well, I think people can look at the same facts and see them differently because of their life experiences
Of
or
course.
because of other surrounding things. And I guess what I'm getting at is we can all believe things passionately that are completely different. And we still.
But you're right about the facts are very important.
There's such a thing as the
Yes.
truth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think you're right. I think you're right. You can't always, and that is something that I said to these students, because when I walked into the classroom, my first comment was, I want to know what your opinion of these books is. But having read their first papers, I came back and said, well, as a matter of fact, I would like you to base your opinions on some facts. You can have an opinion, but it's
Right.
got to be backed up by something real. And you even said, go to the internet. Go to the internet. It's a great source of you can get some information. Writing these historical novels, it's just, great source of, yes.
Well, this book with Mr. Rochester, I forgot your name.
Jane Eyre? Yes.
Excuse me, thank you. That's all right, it's my age catching up with everything. Jane Eyre, if Jane Eyre was made into a movie, several movies, but the
Yes,
one that
yes.
everyone our age remembers is with so-and-so and her. Anyway, you know who I mean, this famous actor.
Laurence Olivier, did he play Mr. Rochester?
No. It was an American actor.
Never mind, yes.
And
I'll Google it.
I'll tell you.
Who?
She's gonna Google
Gonna
it.
Google it.
oh, good. And the English actress who had another famous sister.
Olivia de Havilland.
Olivia de Havilland was the sister, but the actress who played
Joan Fontaine.
Joan Fontaine. There we go. Thank you. If I had read that book when I was a child, and not had seen the movie, then when I saw the movie, I would think that my interpretation of these two characters would have been quite different.
Yeah.
Then, had I seen the movie and then read the book later on as an adult or as an experienced woman, I would have read something different.
Yes, no, that's very true. Absolutely, certainly, and that bears your point out that, as you change, so does the book change. And each time you go back to it, you see something different in it. So that's the wonderful, particularly if it's a book that is a rich resource that you can read again and again. And I think that Jane Eyre really is a book like that, that we can read over our life cycle and interpret it and see it differently. And also the point about film, the image taking the, it comes in the way, it gets in the way a little bit of our own mental image. We read the book and we imagine Mr. Rochester or Jane Eyre, and then we watch the movie, and oops, it's gone. The movie I showed actually in the classroom was the one with Fassbender, who plays
Michael.
Mr. Rochester. And they all said, oh, but he's much too handsome. Yes, he's very handsome.
Orson Welles was the person.
Oh,
Yes.
Orson Welles, wow.
Oh, you Googled
I
it.
looked it up.
Her brain told her.
Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
Sorry, just, I'm thinking about, I read Cracked, and I saw the film, and I remember just talking to you about it, and it, I mean, think of how differently the director interpreted what you wrote. I mean, he wasn't exactly, I mean, there was a lot of disconnect, I thought.
Yes,
To the way-
this is a book I wrote. It's a boarding school story. Takes place in South Africa in the book, and it was made into a film. And the director was English, Jordan Scott, the daughter of Ridley Scott. Anyway, so she said, well, she didn't know South Africa, so she wanted it to take place in England. And it was cheaper to do it in Ireland. So the film actually was filmed in Ireland, and they used quite a bit of the dialogue. I actually thought it was a very good film myself. Cracks, yes, it was one of my novels. Takes place in a boarding school. It's actually about sexual harassment with a teacher. Even more egregious in a way, yes. Crack like a crack in the wall, yes. Yeah.
I'll tell you something humorous.
Yes.
I said to a friend once, my fantasy of a man was a
Uh-huh.
combination of Orson Welles as Mr. Rochester and Laurence Olivier in Rebecca as okay, and that's why did they both get that mealy-mouthed Joan Fontaine? And she said to me, you know the one he put in the attic? And you know the one he drowned in the boat? That's you. After that, he said, he was Joan Fontaine. Somebody controllable.
So, any other questions?
Well, I'd like to ask you, just
Yes.
after you wrote that book, having had this a subject of your
She was mealy.
your life, you know, much of your life, did things change for you?
Well, people often ask me that, you know, is there some kind of closure? If you write about something like this and you actually write a memoir using the truth as close as you can get to the truth anyway, it's obviously is a certain satisfaction, I think, and you do discover things in the writing. But closure in the sense of moving on, no, I'm afraid not. Those ghosts are always with me, and they always will be. And in fact, the writing probably is a way to hold on to them, the people that you've lost, and the parts of your life that are gone. So when you write, you can bring those back and recreate them in a wonderful way on the page. So I was able in the book to bring my sister back and have her as she was, a beautiful young woman, full of life and curiosity, and with her young children. And I described scenes that I remember of moments when we had both got newborn babies, and we met in a villa in Italy, and we would both be up at night, and she'd be with her little boy and I'd be with my girl, and we would just sit together and be able to share that. So that was wonderful to write that, and I'm glad to have preserved in a way memory, because also a way of preserving things is to write them down.
Well, Sheila, I would also say then you're considering, you know, you have to weigh certain things should you write, and it's your story and you're preserving. But it would seem to me that it's really a gift to your sister, in a way.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I hope so. That was my intention. I wanted to give her a voice, and she never had one. And she would, you know, I would say to her, leave him. And she would say, I can't. I'm too frightened. He has the children's passports. Or she'd say, you go to the lawyer for me, you go. And I would go, and the lawyer would say, but listen, if your sister can't get to the lawyer, we're not going to be able to get her a divorce. It's very difficult when a woman is being battered for her to escape that without being killed, which is what ultimately happened, I think, that she meant to...
6 children in a bad marriage?
I'm sorry? Why did she have 6
children in a bad marriage?
Yes. That's a question.
Well, that was probably part of his control.
Yes, it was, and I think some of it was perhaps rape. But it is true, you know, and this is, she would come to my mother too, you know, battered and bruised, and my mother would say, well, stay with me, but she would go back. She would go back. And he would apologize, promise to do better. Hope, yes.
I'm one of those 6 children, not in that family, but I know what it's like to be an adult child of an alcoholic. You say he wasn't, but somebody who can be brutal, like
Yes.
Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type of a scene. And my mother, Joan, funny that they should pick a Joan for the character to play that woman. I used to wonder as a child, why would you stay with somebody who was so violent? But he scared everybody in his addiction or whatever it was. It was so frightening that every time she tried to get away, you definitely had a feeling of, you're not going to get out of here alive. So
And there were
play
places
quiet.
then.
Don't have a
where
boy
to
with
go.
you. Exactly what you're talking
Yes,
about.
and when she told me, she said, I'm frightened. That's what she said. She said, I'm frightened. But you can't conceive of somebody actually dying. You can't conceive that they might die in circumstances like that.
What did you say about the accident?
What did he say?
About the accident?
Oh, he didn't say anything. He didn't say anything, certainly not to me. And my mother, with what one might think of as admirable Christian forgivingness, or that's the way she saw it anyway, sat by his bedside and held his hand. And it's strange. It was very strange to me. I didn't want to go near him. And I think she knew he killed her. She must have. So I think we're coming to we've got a few more minutes.
Well, absolutely.
Yes, all right.
Yeah.
So if people,
I think when I was a little girl, ever so long ago, that I was fortunate that my mother was so far advanced out of her time zone. She was a woman who could understand things far away from just being female. And she said to me when I was little, don't let anyone touch you.
wow,
Don't let anyone hit you.
gosh.
And she said it calmly, quietly, but it reverberated inside me. And I wouldn't let that happen to me. And I'm going to tell a story now about myself and a famous man in Hollywood. And I'm saying this for the very first time. I've written it down so I remember the names. There was a famous producer at Universal Studios named Jim Aubrey. He had a man working with him, a young, terrible actor named Keith Brazil. Keith Brazil was Jim Aubrey's procurer. I was under contract at Universal Studios in the early 60s. Keith Brazil let it be known that Jim Aubrey, who had seen me in a pilot called My Favorite Martian with Ray Walston and Bill Bixby, I had a running role in that pilot. It was the first one sold out of 60 pilots made. It was picked up immediately by Kellogg. I would not go to bed with Jim Aubrey. I was written out of the pilot, reshot the scenes where I was the daughter in the pilot, and made a visiting relative. That show ran for 3 full years, and God knows how many reruns. I was raising a daughter by myself. I had been married and divorced, and I had a child that needed a great deal of medical attention. I was the sole support.
What a difficult
That would have
situation.
been
Yeah.
wonderful for me and for my daughter, for her future as well. I never said anything to anyone.
Well,
But
there was
Jim
nowhere
Aubrey-
to
I wrote
go,
Jim
right?
Aubrey- I wrote Jim Aubrey a letter. I didn't realize that there was a term called sexual harassment, which is exactly what happened to me. I wrote him a letter and I said, do you realize what you've done? You have taken away an important livelihood. He didn't write back. He called. I was on a stage set at that time, and he called and he said, not on My Favorite Martian. And he said, we're looking for another role for you. But, that was it.
Well, I'm sure these things went on all the time.
Yes, they did.
And they- So, well, we pretty much.
Sheila, could I ask you one last question?
Yes, sure.
Which is, what are you writing?
What am I writing now? Well, I'm talking about this class on silenced voices. I've taken a character from a book which you may know called Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's. And in that book there is a prostitute, Sonia, who is portrayed as an angel. And I have given her a voice because I felt her life must have been much more complicated than the one that Dostoevsky so brilliantly portrays. But anyway, so that is my, I'm not sure if it's sitting with my editor at the moment. And I'm hoping it will see the light of day, and then I will be able to come back to here and talk about it maybe in a year or so.
What's the book? Do you have an acting title?
Well, I wanted to call it The Murderer and the Harlot, but my agent said harlot was too old-fashioned a word, so it may be called Sonia's Story. I'm not sure what, they come up with titles very often. I mean, this title, Becoming Jane Eyre, I did not. I wanted to call it No Coward Soul, which is a line from Emily Bronte's poem. And I wanted to write about the courage, no coward soul. But people said, oh, it sounds like Noel Coward, or, you know, various things like that. So it came out as Becoming Jane Eyre, which is, I'm sure, a better title. Yes.
Well, Sheila, it's just been a wonderful, too brief hour, but a wonderful talk and discussion. And for those of you who haven't read your book, this book, I'm speaking of the memoir. I haven't actually read the other one yet, but I recently finished the Sisters.
Yes.
Once We Were Sisters, and I found it a wonderful book to read, and I hope you will all read it at some point. And Sheila, I do thank you for coming all the way here, and I think we've all